On the 11th of November 1941, Captain Nishino of I-17 was called to a meeting with a variety of other submarine commanders to be briefed on the upcoming Operation Z, which was the attack on Pearl Harbor. I-17's orders, along with I-9, I-15, and I-25, were to patrol northeast of Oahu and attack any U.S. ships that attempted to escape the harbor. I-15 and I-17 depart Japan on the 21st of November 1941 on their first war patrol, and they stationed northeast of Oahu, though during the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, they did not come across any hostile ships, so they were relatively inactive for that day. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, 9 Japanese submarines were stationed off the U.S. west coast in order to carry out reconnaissance missions and disrupt any U.S. fleet sorties. Being so early in the war, the United States anti-submarine warfare was relatively limited, and besides the occasional aircraft and small boat patrol, the Japanese submarines were largely free to conduct any operation they wanted. With the Japanese having the full advantage, they decided to make a daring plan, and on the 14th of December 1941, the submarines received orders to bombard a series of targets along the west coast: I-17, I-9, I-10, I-15, I-19, I-21, I-23, I-25, and I-26 were all given orders to bombard different targets. The bombardment was supposed to take place on the 25th of December, but on the 22nd of December, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto postponed the attack till the 27th. When the 27th arrived, the Japanese submarines were low on fuel reserves, and so the attack was altogether cancelled. Over the next couple of months, I-17 would refuel and resupply, and would harass a couple of U.S. ships along the west coast. On the 22nd of February 1942, the Japanese Navy discovered that President Franklin Roosevelt was going to give a fireside speech on the radio for the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Commander-in-Chief of the Sixth Fleet, Vice Admiral Shimizu, knew that interrupting this radio broadcast would be another method at deteriorating the morale within the United States public. As a result, he sent orders to Captain Nishino aboard I-17 to bombard a target along the west coast from the late December list of his own choice. Captain Nishino convenes with his officers, and they discuss the targets on the list, outright rejecting a few, such as San Francisco, and throwing others into a possibility category, as I-17's safety was a priority in this bombardment. Lieutenant Yamazaki, whom was I-17's engineering officer, suggested that I-17 attack Elwood's oil fields off Santa Barbara because it had an easy access and escape point. Being an oil field, it also had some strategic and tactical value, and due to all of these factors, it was approved as the target. During the early hours of the 23rd of February 1942, I-17 at periscope depth conducted reconnaissance 12 miles north of Santa Barbara. During this reconnaissance, Captain Nishino discovers 2 targets he wants to bombard. He discovers a set of oil storage tanks, and he also locates a building that he identified as an oil refinery. Now all I-17 had to do was wait for President Roosevelt's speech to start at 1900, and at 1910, I-17 surfaced. At this time, the sun was setting, and there was limited lighting from the oil field, so the Japanese had to act quick in order to have visibility on what they were shooting. At 1917, the deck gun crew loaded an armor-piercing shell into the 14-centimeter, 40-caliber, 11th-year naval gun, and the submarine opened fire. The submarine would fire 7 armor-piercing rounds into the oil tanks, and several hits were recorded, but no fires were sighted. After that, the gun crew alters their target to the oil refinery, and they fire 10 more shells. Once again, they claim several hits. After firing those 17 rounds, the ready-use ammunition locker had its supply exhausted, and I-17 ceased fire. By 1935, Captain Nishino could see police officers gathering along the coastline as they had been alerted to the shelling, and air raid sirens could be heard. The area had been blacked out, and the President's broadcast had been cut off. With their mission having been completed, I-17 reverses course and at 2030, it exits at the south end of the Santa Barbara Channel. Captain Nishino had radioed the Sixth Fleet commander, informing him that the oil field had been left in flames and ruin. In reality, the damage to the oil field was approximately $500, and no fires had broken out, as some of the shells fired from I-17 were duds, and the accuracy of the shooting was very poor. While the material impact of the bombardment was non-existent, the psychological impact had the greatest effect the Japanese could have wanted it to. Within 30 minutes of the bombardment, there was a mandatory blackout from Monterey to San Diego, and it was enforced by local police. U.S. citizens who could hear the bombardment but had no visuals on what was occurring began trying to call around, figuring out what was happening, which resulted in phone lines being jammed, and rumors quickly spread that the Japanese were either bombing the U.S. mainland with aircraft, or even worse, an amphibious landing had occurred. While the psychological impact was a victory for the Japanese, there were a few issues that occurred during this bombardment that would end up hindering the Japanese in the long run. Firstly, the U.S. public was now aware that the Japanese were in a position to attack the United States, and war bond sales skyrocketed. These sales would help reinforce the war effort that would eventually lead to the downfall of the Japanese Empire. And as a result of this bombardment, one of the most controversial acts the United States conducted during the Second World War occurred, and this was the imprisonment of tens of thousands of Japanese American citizens. The thought of a mainland invasion was terrifying to the United States, and the thought that Japanese Americans could assist the Japanese Empire internally was even worse, so removing these people from the streets eliminated that problem. Of course, as we know in the long run, the Japanese were never in a position to invade the U.S. mainland, and given a couple of years, the Japanese Empire didn't exist. I-17's attack was brave and one of a kind, but its overall impact on the war was virtually non-existent for the Japanese. Given another year, I-17 would be yet another of one of Japan's submarines that were added to the sunken action list. With that having been said, there is nothing more to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.